America's naval fleet would be a tremendous asset to the Allies winning the war. American destroyers, the small, fast surface ships that hunted for submarines, and the merchant fleet brought supplies to the Allies. About half of the German subfleet would be destroyed by the United States Navy in the last 12 months of the war. And this allowed the convoy troops ships and the convoy cargo ships to reach the British civilians and their military, bringing the vast supplies that were needed, with very few being lost. The soldiers themselves, the Allied Expeditionary Force, often nicknamed the Doughboys because of their fresh and clean and pale appearance, kind of like fresh bread dough, especially once you compared them to their French and British counterparts who had been fighting in the trenches for several years, exposed to the elements. They began to ship some of this Allied Expeditionary Force to Europe in 1917, but most of them did not arrive until well into 1918. And in total, about 2 million were sent. The United States prepared to head to Europe. The situation there was changing dramatically. Russia's internal revolution had resulted in the overthrow and the eventual execution of Tsar Nicholas II and the entire Russian royal family, which ultimately led to Russia withdrawing from the war. And they had been fighting along Germany's eastern front. This would allow Germany to redeploy its battle-tested divisions to the front in France. And for the first time in the war, Germany would employ superior numbers along that western front. It was because of this that Germany felt that any help the United States gave would be too little, too late. Wilson, however, was concerned that the spread of communism was a great threat to peace and international stability, and had actually attempted to intervene in the Russian Revolution. But instead, all he probably accomplished was helping to prolong the Russian Civil War, which resulted in thousands more casualties. In the spring of 1918, Germany launched a massive drive along the Western Front. And by late May, they were within 40 miles of Paris. The first significant engagements of U.S. troops in this European war would be approximately 30,000 soldiers who were thrown into a breach in Allied lines at the Battle of the Chateau Thierry, at the heart of the German advance. Headlines in American newspapers would boast about how the Americans had saved Paris. U.S. forces would also participate in the French counteroffensive at the Second Battle of the Marne, but it really wasn't until September of 1918 that large numbers of American troops, 9 divisions worth, were in place.
It was not until the summer of 1918 that U.S. forces began to make a significant difference on the Western Front. In the fall at Saint Mihiel, and in the final campaign of the Meuse-Argonne. New technological advances included tank warfare.
General John J. Pershing had been assigned to head the United States Army, a separate army rather than simply bolstering British and French forces. His army was assigned a front of 85 miles, starting along the Swiss border, and would undertake the Meuse-Argonne offensive from September 26 through November 11, 1918. This attack was part of the last major Allied assault, involving several million men. It would be the largest battle thus far in U.S. history, lasting 47 days with more than 1.2 million American soldiers engaged. But suffering from the desertion of its allies and the British blockade finally causing critical food shortages, plus the ongoing Allied assault, Germany was ready to be done. Encouraged by Wilson's 14 points, which had been part of a speech Wilson had made to Congress back in January of 1918, suggesting a plan for peace after the war was over, Germany turned to a seemingly moderate Wilson, seeking peace based on those 14 points. One of Wilson's demands, though, was that Kaiser Wilhelm II be removed before any armistice would be negotiated. Faced with defeat and loss of support, the Kaiser fled Germany, abandoning his rule in October of 1918. A new German government then began negotiating a ceasefire, which went into effect on the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. At that time, Germany laid down her arms. The war was over, and all was quiet on the Western Front. About 10 million soldiers died between the two sides amongst all of the armies who fought in the war. America lost over 112,000 men, more than half of whom died from disease. An estimated 20 million civilians died in some way related to the war as well, many of them as a result of an influenza pandemic, sometimes dubbed the Spanish flu, that seemed to target healthy young adults more so than the old or the weak. In total, about 500 million people worldwide contracted that influenza virus, and it wasn't just limited to Europe. And an estimated 50 to 100 million died worldwide from influenza. Remember, those numbers do include totals of nations that are not involved in World War I as well. In addition to the soldiers killed, 20 million civilians died from causes related to the war. And those numbers are just estimates, as the true number of dead can potentially never be known. As the war wound down, Wilson would also have to face a significant new reality. He no longer had a Democratic Congress to make it easier to pass legislation or to sign treaties. The Democrats had lost control of the House and the Senate in the midterm elections of 1918, which had occurred just days before the armistice. It's believed that the United States getting involved in the European war in the first place was part of what contributed to that loss. Because really, the US getting involved in World War I wasn't a totally popular decision. There was also fears that political unrest would break the delicate peace. It seemed to some that Europe was slipping into some type of anarchy, and there were particularly fears that the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which introduced communism, would somehow spill into the rest of Europe and overtake the democracies of Western Europe. Wilson further angered Republicans by going to Paris personally and by excluding all Republican senators from the peace delegation. The Big Four, Wilson for the United States, David Lloyd George for England, Georges Clemenceau for France, and Vittorio Orlando for Italy, met at the Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris, though each had their own agenda. These European leaders did not embrace Wilson's ideas as he had proposed in those 14 points, despite Wilson's overwhelming popularity amongst the European masses. The Versailles Treaty itself, that was negotiated by the Big Four, included a war guilt clause, which placed the sole blame for World War I on Germany, and as a result, Germany would be severely punished. They had hoped to sign a treaty based on Wilson's 14 points, but Wilson had been forced to compromise away many of those points, and the end treaty only had 4 of the original 14. Germany would be obliged to pay reparations to the Allies, initially $56 billion and later reduced to $31 billion over 30 years. And they were forced to accept severe military restrictions, as well as the loss of territory. Self-determination would be granted to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Finland, as well as the Baltic states of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Yugoslavia, much of whose territories were stripped from either Germany or the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. As part of the peace treaty and as part of his original 14 points, Wilson sought to establish a world parliament to be known as the League of Nations. It was meant to provide collective security and prevent something like World War I from ever happening again. It called on all members to protect the territorial integrity and political independence of all other members. The United States, France, Britain, Italy, and Japan would be permanent members, and there were to be 42 allied countries meeting in a General Assembly of Nations. Germany and Russia were specifically excluded from participation in the League. For the most part, European nations and the European people supported the creation of the League of Nations, but it would be a fight to get it approved in the United States. Wilson, who had returned home to the United States after the initial negotiations, returned to France to formally sign the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919.
The Treaty of Versailles was hammered out by the Council of Four and the other participants. But the Versailles Treaty was rejected by an isolationist Congress, and with it, the League
Republican
of
senators,
Nations.
especially Henry Cabot Lodge, who opposed the treaty as written, because they saw it as an infringement of the U.S. role in the Western Hemisphere. Lodge was also concerned that it could interfere with Congress's constitutional power to declare war. He hoped to be able to amend the treaty, but realizing that wasn't possible, settled for preparing a list of reservations that he hoped would still allow the U.S. to join the League. These reservations would essentially address the issues about Congress's war-declaring powers as well as other issues. The Democrats in the Senate, following Wilson's direction, opposed any reservations. They wanted the treaty as it was written. And there were some Republican senators for whom no amount of reservations could convince them to participate in the League of Nations at all. Most Republicans, though, opposed joining under Wilson's term because they felt that the League could force the United States to enter a war without the approval of Congress. And so most Republicans followed Lodge in supporting various changes. Believing that the American public favored the treaty as written, Wilson decided to appeal over the heads of the Senate, going directly to the people, going on an ambitious speaking tour. Physicians advised the president not to, as his health was becoming in question. He did believe correctly that the public favored the League of Nations, but incorrectly in that the public was more in favor of modifications. While in Pueblo, Colorado, President Wilson collapsed from physical and nervous exhaustion on September 25, 1919. A few days later, he had a massive stroke that paralyzed him, and he would be unable to meet with his cabinet for more than 7 months. Senator Lodge then brought the treaty to a vote, with his reservations included, but the Democrats in the Senate, following Wilson's direction, rejected Lodge's proposal to join the League with changes. When the treaty was brought up for a vote as it was written, the Senate Republicans voted against it. Ironically, 4/5 of all senators actually supported the treaty in some form. They just couldn't agree on the details. The Senate tried again in March of 1920, and the results were the same. Wilson then urged that the presidential election of 1920 be a solemn national referendum on the treaty. Many historians believe that his health had made him unwilling to compromise on any of these issues. And when the Democrats lost the election of 1920, the treaty was never signed, and the League of Nations was never ratified by the United States. The public clearly desired to change from idealism to isolationism. As a result of the war, though, the United States would emerge as the world's economic and political leader. Britain, France, Austria, and Turkey would go into various states of decline. Germany would be devastated by the Versailles Treaty, which would then set the stage for the situation that would lead to the Second World War.